I went, did my firearms training, threw myself into it. It was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. You know, you did it, the load and reload, and you did it again, and you did it again, and you shot and shot and shot and shot and shot, and then you ran round and climbed over things and went under things. And so it was grueling, both mentally and physically. And you trained and trained and trained and trained and trained. And at the end of the 2 weeks, I think it was, you know, you had your final shoot and you had to hit the right mark to get your pink ticket and carry your gun. And then you went back to your refresher training so often. And you would never be able to get away with this now, but I'll tell you what I did. The night before I went firearms training, I always had a few drinks and a very late night. And I deliberately sleep deprived myself. So the following morning, when I went to firearms training, I essentially, you know, had not had enough quality sleep. I was knackered, tired, I'd been drinking the night before. And I did it because I was thinking that was my own internal prep. So that, because I don't know that I'm going to feel chirpy and chipper and have had a good night's sleep whenever I get given a gun in my hand, because the situations arise. So I deliberately made life difficult for myself when I went on that training. Because I think if I could do it under those circumstances, you know, I'm sure you couldn't do that now because you'd probably get breathalyzed before you go firearms training. You'd probably get drug swiped and all of that. But, you know, you could still do it on very little sleep, couldn't you? You know, you could factor that into your training, just so you're bringing a bit of interior pressure on yourself. Anyway, one morning, I'm at Kensington, I'm a detective in the CID office. A mate of mine, I overhear a telephone call, and this detective was all right, but a bit less experienced than me, and I heard firearms and murderer and escape and all these words being mentioned. So I kind of took pretty close attention. And when the phone call ended, I went, okay, mate, what's all that about? I'll try and shrink this story. A man called James Alexander Bagri had been convicted of murder in Scotland. What he'd done during a robbery, he'd put a shotgun into a publican's back and pulled both barrels and essentially nearly cut this poor man in half, killed him, of course. Bagri was arrested, convicted of murder and sent to a high security prison. He had committed a very audacious escape from the prison. He'd broken his own arm so he could have a cast put on it and he could use the cast to break windows and all kind of stuff. Scaled the roofs, blah, blah, blah. He was Scotland's most wanted man. The Scotland police had searched the home address of his best friend and they'd ripped the place asunder. You know, wallpaper off the walls, floorboards up, everything, the lot. And they'd found nothing except for one small scrap of paper which had a London telephone number on it. They'd done a subscriber check on that number and it came to an address on our patch in Kensington. It was a large, old sort of Victorian house, I think, set across about 4 or 5 floors, which was now divided into flats, bedsits. So they'd asked my colleague, you know, can you go and check this address out? He made some inquiries. Essentially, it was agreed the following day, the bedsit that we thought this man might sleep in, we'd identified. So me and a colleague both booked out guns first thing the following morning. We went up, I kicked the door in, straight into this twin-bedded room. One bed is empty, one bed has got someone sleeping in it. So I'm there pointing my gun at him, you know, get out, comply, do what you're told, my finger's on the trigger. I'm perfectly prepared for any non-compliance here. He told us that the guy who slept in the other bed had gone out with some friends the night before. He was a lovely guy, and just, you know, gave no indicator that he was a wanted escaped murderer. There was a picture on the mantelpiece. I looked at this picture and we had a picture for his mugshot from when Bagri had been arrested. And we tried to compare it with this picture and we weren't sure. You know, you couldn't be sure. And that's so often happens with photographs. So anyway, when the kid from the other bed wasn't looking, I pocketed that photograph. Shows how long ago it was. I was going to get that photograph to Heathrow Airport, have it flown up to Scotland on the first flight, and then be able to say whether it was him or not, right? Before technology. But anyway, so we did what we had to do there, left that room, went outside, having the big major conversation of the morning, where are we going to go and get breakfast? And there was something in my mind. I'd heard that the guy in the room that might be Bakery worked as a builder. I think the kid from the other bed had said he worked as a builder or something. So whilst my colleagues are talking about which cafe to go to for breakfast, I'm scanning up and down the road. I was always a very, very nosy kind of detective. And I see what looks like a builder's van. So I go, right, let's go and have a nose around that. My other colleague with the other gun has disappeared off for breakfast with half of the team as well. So there's me and 3 or 4 others. And I look through the front windscreen of this van, you know, check its tax disc. We used to have tax discs in those days. Have a nose around, see what I can see. There's a partition behind the driver and the passenger seat, which separates off the back of the van, which has got a bit of a window in it, but I can't really see very much. I go round to the back of the back of the van and stick my hand on the door handle, as you do. And to my surprise, it opened. So, of course, never look a gift horse in the mouth. I open the door and I clamber in the van. And I'm literally getting in the van when suddenly a head pops up from beneath a blanket, right? Instantly, training, right? I knew we'd get back to training at some point. Training kicks in. My hand goes inside my jacket to try and get my gun out of my shoulder holster. But instantaneously, I went, "Good morning, I'm an armed police officer." The first thing I said, just training, drilled into you. And as I'm clumsily trying to get my gun out, the next thing he's gone like that. And that far away from my nose is a sawn-off, double-barreled, up and over shotgun. Well, I gave up my efforts to try and get my gun because clearly he was quicker on the draw than I was. So in the finest traditions of the Metropolitan Police, I legged it, right? Shouting to my colleagues, who were still having a chat about which cafe we're going to, he's got a gun, right? Rather louder and with a bit more urgency and energy than that, I hasten to add. They clearly knew I wasn't joking because I've gone off down the road like a long dog, right? Dived under a car about 4 or 5 cars away, got my gun out, excuse me, and of course I'm thinking he's going to come out any moment, all guns blazing, you know, and it's about 6:30, maybe 7 o'clock, so the neighbourhood is beginning to wake up, you know, people are coming out of their houses, going to work. I now know clearly this is the escaped murderer with a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. This is a very tense situation, and it's only me with my Smith & Wesson revolver, right? That's how long ago it was, mid-80s. It's really not a good situation. But once again, to shrink that story, I just shouted at him, "You are surrounded by armed police. Come out, lay your weapon down, come out with your hands up." I was just bullshitting him. You know, he wasn't surrounded by armed police. It was me and my Smith & Wesson, and that was it. But, you know, sometimes you just chance your arm. And I clearly sounded that authoritative that he thought, oh yeah, I am. And he stayed in that van for 36 hours. There was a big siege. Most of West London ground to a halt because of road closures and all of that. It was a lead story on the news. And 36 hours later, he decided that rather than go back to a life in prison, he would take his own life. So he put the shotgun to his head and that was the end of him.